The world entered 2025 like someone walking through a dark corridor, aware that something lies ahead but unsure of what it might be. Global tensions were no longer just rumors. They were on the news, on social media, in street conversations. The sense that something monumental was about to happen spread like electricity in the air. And in this atmosphere, eyes turned to a figure who, though dead for decades, seemed to have left messages meant exactly for this moment. Vanga. The blind Bulgarian seer, known for predictions that defied both time and logic, had allegedly warned a specific year, 2025, as a breaking point. What once seemed like just another forgotten prophecy began to gain weight when unfolding events started to align with disturbing precision. According to records preserved by scholars and Vanga's followers, she had said that in a year of fire and silence, leaders will hide and secrets will be revealed. For a long time, this phrase was interpreted symbolically, but it started to make sense when confidential documents began circulating within the U.S. government, and the name of Donald Trump reemerged, not as a former president, but as the central figure of an underground movement. Sources close to the political circle revealed that Trump was in possession of highly sensitive files, documents that had not been turned over when he left the White House and that, according to him, would change everything if revealed. The phrase, uttered during a private dinner, leaked, and the world began to ask, what is being hidden? Meanwhile, Vanga's words resurfaced in global debates, not as mere curiosity, but as a warning. She had predicted that a war will rise not from weapons, but from words that cannot be denied. And the documents Trump allegedly held seemed to contain precisely that. Words, records, evidence that could realign alliances, expose strategies, and undermine the official narrative of recent events. The tension was not only between nations, it was within them. The American government, pressured by leaks, began operating behind the scenes. Emergency meetings, intelligence maneuvers, attempts at containment. But what was coming could no longer be stopped. Across the Atlantic, Europe began to feel the tremors. Vanga had said that the old continent would be shaken by decisions not made by its own hands. And this began to unfold as European leaders started questioning the legitimacy of treaties and alliances that, according to leaked files, had been manipulated. Trust between nations eroded, and the fear of a silent war, not fought with tanks and missiles, but with information, revelations, and inconvenient truths, began to spread. Trump, for his part, did not deny it. In cryptic interviews, he stated, "The people deserve to know the truth." But he never revealed what truth, only hints. And these hints began to be cross-referenced with Vanga's prophecies. She had said, "A man with golden hair will bring to light what was buried." Her followers began pointing directly to Trump. The coincidence was unsettling, and the U.S. political establishment grew restless, not only because of potential exposure, but also because of the shock waves it could send through global stability. The climate was one of pre-collapse. Stock markets fluctuated wildly on rumors. Social media turned into a battlefield between believers of the prophecy and skeptics who mocked it. Yet the events kept aligning. Vanga had warned that the world will be divided between those who know and those who deny. That division began to manifest. Ordinary people started seeking information, questioning narratives, distrusting everything. Governments, in turn, tightened control, censorship disguised as security, surveillance disguised as protection, all in the name of stability. But instability had already taken root. Thus, the year 2025 did not begin with explosions. It began with whispers, whispers that became alarms, alarms that could no longer be ignored. Vanga, though dead, seemed more present than ever. Trump, though out of power, seemed more influential than ever. And between them stood the world, a world uncertain whether it was about to awaken or collapse. But one thing was clear, nothing would ever be the same again. The files that cannot be denied. What began as a rumor in the corridors of power turned into an avalanche of revelations. The files Donald Trump allegedly kept after leaving the presidency began to surface, not by his own will, but by pressure. Inside sources, former advisors, retired intelligence agents, all began to speak. And what was once speculation became a puzzle that, when pieced together, revealed a far more complex scenario than any political analyst could have foreseen. Baba Vanga, in one of her most obscure prophecies, is said to have declared that the man who was king without a crown will bring to light what was buried beneath the throne. A phrase ignored for decades now seemed to perfectly describe what was happening. The documents were not mere reports. They were records of secret meetings, recordings of conversations that should never have been heard, memos contradicting the official versions of historic events. They included mentions of agreements between leaders never disclosed, strategies to manipulate public opinion, and even contingency plans for scenarios that officially never existed. When confronted, Trump did not deny it. He simply stated, "The people have the right to know." That phrase, repeated in interviews and speeches, became a mantra for those who believed he was about to reveal a new truth. The U.S. government, in turn, entered containment mode. Emergency meetings were called. National security departments began tracking leaks. But it was too late. The documents were already circulating. And what they revealed was disturbing. Baba Vanga is said to have warned that war will come when secrets are treated as lies. And the secrets were being treated exactly that way, denied, distorted, discredited. Yet the facts were there, and those able to read between the lines began to realize the world was on the verge of change. Among the files were records of operations on foreign soil never officially acknowledged. There was proof of election interference, not only in the United States, but in strategic countries. Documents showed how narratives had been built to justify military, economic, and diplomatic actions. And all of this was now in the hands of a man whom Baba Vanga had predicted would return not to rule, but to reveal. What once sounded absurd now seemed like an exact description of unfolding events. The media, torn between the duty to inform and the fear of reprisal, began publishing excerpts of the documents. The impact was immediate. Allied countries began questioning their ties to the U.S. Leaders started taking positions. The UN called extraordinary meetings, and the world entered a state of alert, not because of weapons, but because of words that could no longer be denied. Baba Vanga had once said that truth will be the most dangerous weapon. And now that weapon was in circulation. Trump, for his part, began to move strategically. Meetings with influential figures, carefully staged public appearances, speeches mixing patriotism with revelation. He claimed that the system needs to be exposed, and his followers began to treat the documents as undeniable proof of a global conspiracy. Polarization grew. Those who believed in the revelation started organizing. Those who denied it became increasingly isolated, and the country spiraled into a tension that could no longer be contained. Europe, directly affected by the documents, began to reassess its alliances. Baba Vanga had foretold that the continent will be divided from within, and that division began to take shape. Nations that once walked together started drifting apart. Trust was broken, and the fear of a silent war, a war of narratives, of inconvenient truths, became reality. There was no turning back. The files were out, and the world had to deal with them. The impact was not only political, it was spiritual. People began questioning everything: history, faith, identity. Baba Vanga had warned that when the veil is torn, the eyes will see what the heart refuses to accept. And that tearing was now happening. People were awakening, not by choice but by necessity. Truth, once revealed, demands change. And that change began manifesting at every level: social, economic, spiritual. The world was in transition, and Trump, with his files, was the catalyst. Perhaps, looking at all this, we can understand that 2025 is not just a year. It is a portal, a turning point, a moment when what was hidden can no longer be ignored. Baba Vanga, with her enigmatic words, seems to have left a map, and Trump, with his documents, seems to be following that map. And between them stands a world that must choose whether to deny or to awaken, to resist or to transform, to continue as it is, or to accept that nothing will ever be the same again. The invisible war in a world on edge. The world was not prepared for what began to unfold after the secret files linked to Donald Trump started circulating. It was not just a matter of U.S. domestic politics. It was a silent implosion of global trust. The documents revealed not only hidden strategies but also underground agreements between powers that, on the surface, presented themselves as adversaries. Baba Vanga, in one of her most unsettling prophecies, was said to have declared, "War will come when allies turn into enemies, and enemies are revealed as brothers." And this inversion began to manifest with speed that frightened even the most seasoned analysts. European countries started to revisit treaties. NATO went on high alert. Russia, which appeared repeatedly throughout the documents, responded with ambiguous statements, at times denying, at times insinuating that the truth has always been in plain sight. China, on the other hand, maintained complete silence, which for observers was a sign that something much larger was being orchestrated behind scenes. Baba Vanga was said to have predicted that the dragon will sleep until the lion roars, and the lion for many was Trump, who, even out of office, seemed to be triggering an unprecedented geopolitical realignment. The United States, pressured by allies and by its own people, began to fall into institutional collapse. Investigations were launched. Special committees were convened. But everything seemed to be chasing after a truth that had already escaped. The documents were in private hands, on servers beyond the government's reach, spreading across networks that multiplied by the hour. And what they revealed was not just corruption or manipulation. It was a global engineering control, built over decades, sustained by carefully crafted narratives. Baba Vanga was said to have foretold, "The world will be ruled by those who control what others believe." And that belief was crumbling. Populations across many countries began to fracture. Those who believed in the revelations organized, protested, and demanded transparency. Those who denied them closed themselves off in information bubbles, trying to cling to normalcy. But normalcy was already gone. Social media became battlefields. Traditional media lost credibility. Governments, unsure of how to react, began to harden. Censorship laws were passed. Platforms were shut down. People were arrested for sharing fragments of files. Baba Vanga had said, "When the truth is forbidden, the war has already begun." And this war had no tanks, it had data. Trump, meanwhile, continued to act, not as a politician, but as a catalyst. He appeared at events, gave interviews, dropped cryptic phrases. He declared that the world needs to be remade. And his followers began to treat the documents as a new political gospel. It was no longer about left or right. It was about revelation. And this revelation spread like wildfire. Baba Vanga had said, "The man who does not govern will be the one who moves those who govern." And that movement was already underway. The UN, pressured by countries demanding answers, began to lose authority. Meetings ended without consensus. Resolutions were ignored. And the world began to fragment. Economic blocs fell apart. Trade agreements were suspended. Tension grew with each passing day. There was no trust left. And without trust, there can be no diplomacy. Baba Vanga was said to have warned, "The world will be divided not by borders, but by fear." And fear was everywhere. Fear of what was coming. Fear of what was already happening. Fear that everything once believed might have been a lie. The spiritual impact also began to intensify. People reported strange dreams, feelings of déjà vu, unexplained restlessness. Churches began to speak of the end times. Religious leaders started to take positions. And Baba Vanga's prophecy was quoted in pulpits, videos, and writings. She had said, "The spirit of the world will be shaken, and those who are not firm will fall." And this fall was not physical, it was internal. People began questioning everything, their faith, their history, their identity. And this questioning was the beginning of transformation. The world was in suspense. There were no explosions, but there were collapses. No gunfire, but ruptures. No invasions, but revelations. And these revelations were reconfiguring everything. Baba Vanga, though long dead, seemed more present than ever. And Trump, though out of power, seemed more influential than ever. And between the two stood the world, a world unsure if it was awakening or collapsing, but certain of one thing: nothing would ever be the same again. The day of rupture and the invisible control. The world had reached a tipping point. There were no sirens, no official announcements. But those paying attention noticed. Something had changed. Baba Vanga, in one of her most enigmatic prophecies, was said or declared, "The day of rupture will come without warning, and those unprepared will be swallowed by silence." And that silence began to spread. Digital platforms went offline without explanation. Communication channels were interrupted. Security systems failed simultaneously in different countries. And those with backstage access knew. This was not a failure. It was activation. The files Trump kept, now circulating on alternative networks, contained more than just political documents. They included records of global surveillance programs, systems tracking human behavior, algorithms capable of predicting actions before they were taken. It was as if the world had been monitored by an invisible, silent, but relentless intelligence. Baba Vanga was said to have said, "The all-seeing I will not be human, but will be obeyed like a god." And the documents revealed that this I had been active for years. It had just not yet been revealed. The revelation caused panic, not because people didn't know they were being watched, but because now they understood how. The files detailed how data was collected, cross-referenced, and interpreted, how decisions were influenced without anyone noticing, how elections, social movements, and even economic crises were shaped by systems operating above governments. Baba Vanga was said to have said, "Power will be taken from men and given to machines." And that transfer had already happened. It just awaited recognition. Trump, in a tense public appearance, declared, "The world is being governed by those no one elected." And this phrase, which seemed conspiratorial, was confirmed by excerpts from the documents. There were references to private consortia, networks of influence, groups operating outside official structures, yet deciding the course of nations. Baba Vanga was said to have said, "Those who rule will have no face, and those who obey will not know why." And this prophecy, once dismissed as exaggeration, now seemed an accurate description of reality. Technology, long seen as progress, now revealed itself as a tool of control. The files showed how household devices were used to listen, how apps collected more than data. They collected emotional patterns, moral decisions, unconscious impulses. It was as if the world were being mapped not by territory, but by consciousness. Baba Vanga was said to have said, "The map of the new world will be drawn with thoughts." And that map was already being built. Governments began to collapse, not from lack of power, but from lack of legitimacy. People started to question everything. Who decides? Who controls? Who observes? And the answers did not come, because those who knew could not speak, and those who spoke were not heard. Baba Vanga was said to have said, "Those who tell the truth will be treated as madmen until the world itself goes mad." And this world was already delirious, trying to maintain normality while everything crumbled from within. The rupture was not a single event. It was a process that began with revelations and ended with disconnection. People started withdrawing from networks, seeking silence, gathering in small groups, in isolated places. It was as if humanity was trying to protect itself from itself. Baba Vanga was said to have said, "Those who hide in simplicity will be the ones to see the new dawn." And that simplicity began to become a refuge, not out of fear, but out of clarity. Trump, increasingly surrounded by supporters and critics alike, continued to provoke. He said, "The system is naked, and those who cannot see have chosen blindness." And those who could see began to act, not with violence, but with disconnection. They began to leave the game, to abandon the old structures, to create alternatives. Baba Vanga was said to have said, "The new world will be built by those who no longer want the old one." And this new world began to emerge. Silent, discreet, but real. Perhaps, looking at all of this, we can understand that the prophecy was not about destruction, it was about revelation. Baba Vanga did not speak of an end. She spoke a choice. And Trump, with his files, did not bring chaos. He brought a mirror reflecting what we are, what we accept, what we ignore. And now, standing before that mirror, the world must decide. Continue as it is, or begin anew. Pretend not to see, or accept that everything has changed. Because, as Baba Vanga is said to have said, "The time of lies is over. Now is the time of truth." The new leaders in the fall of invisible crowns. The world was no longer sustained by the structures that had held it for decades. Institutions that once seemed unshakable began to crumble, not from external attacks, but from internal implosion. Trust, the invisible cement of any system, had dissolved. Baba Vanga, in one of her most unsettling prophecies, was said to have declared, "The thrones will fall without anyone pushing them, and those who were never seen will rise without stairs." And this silent ascent began to manifest in every corner of the planet. Unexpected leaders began to emerge. They were not traditional politicians, nor media figures. They were ordinary people with simple words but powerful presence. Doctors, teachers, farmers, former soldiers, young activists, all driven by a force that did not come from power, but from truth. Baba Vanga was said to have said, "Those who speak from the heart will be heard above those who shout with their mouths." And that listening began to spread. Crowds, tired of empty promises, started following those who offered clarity, courage, and connection. Trump, still at the center of the storm, continued to provoke. But now, he was no longer the sole focus. The documents he had revealed had sparked a chain reaction. Other leaders began to emerge, armed with information, evidence, and courage. Some were former intelligence agents, others corporate insiders, others religious figures who had remained silent out of fear. Now they all spoke, and what they spoke was not merely accusation. It was proposal. Baba Vanga was said to have said, "The new world will be drawn by hands that never held pens." And those hands began to write. Traditional structures began to disintegrate. Political parties lost relevance. Churches split. Corporations were abandoned by their own employees. It was as if the world were freeing itself from a spell. Baba Vanga was said to have said, "The enchantment will be broken when the eyes open." And eyes were opening. People began to realize they had been kept in a state of distraction, dependence, and submission. And this realization was the beginning of revolution. But it was not a revolution with flags. It was a revolution of consciousness. People began changing habits, values, and priorities. They sought simplicity, truth, and spirituality. Baba Vanga was said to have said, "The spirit will be the new government." And that government began to manifest. Prayer groups became centers of decision-making. Autonomous communities emerged. Spiritual support networks began replacing social assistance systems. It was as if the world were returning to the essentials. Spirituality, once marginalized, now became central. But not institutionalized spirituality, lived spirituality. People began seeking direct connection with the divine, without intermediaries. They meditated, prayed, and gathered in silence. Baba Vanga was said to have said, "Those who listen to the heavens will guide the earth." And these guides began to appear, not with titles, but with light. A light not seen with the eyes, but felt with the soul. The collapse of traditional structures also brought pain. Many resisted. Many tried to preserve the old ways. Many attacked those bringing the new. Baba Vanga was said to have said, "Those who fight against the truth will be crushed by it." And that struggle intensified. Conflicts emerged. Persecutions increased. But those aligned with a new frequency did not retreat. They knew it was not a physical battle. It was a spiritual one. And in that battle, the weapon was presence. Trump, even surrounded by controversy, continued to be a symbol, not of perfection, but of rupture. Baba Vanga was said to have said, "The man who divides will be the one who begins." And that division, painful as it was necessary, because only when everything breaks can it be rebuilt. And the world was broken, but it was also ready to begin anew, ready to accept that power lies not in palaces, but in hearts, ready to live in truth. Perhaps, looking at all of this, we can understand that the prophecy was not about destruction. It was about revelation. Baba Vanga did not speak of an end. She spoke of a beginning. And that beginning has already started. In simple gestures. In sincere words. In leaders who do not seek power, but service. In those who do not seek applause, but peace. In those who do not seek control, but connection. Because, as she is said to have declared, the new world will be made by those who fear no light. The invisible awakening in the sky that begins to speak. The world seemed to be collapsing, but something silent and profound was happening beneath the surface. It was not just a political crisis or a social revolt. It was a shift in frequency. Baba Vanga, in one of her most mysterious prophecies, is said to have stated, "When men no longer know whom to trust, the sky will begin to speak." And this sky, long ignored, began to manifest, not with thunder, but with signs, not with spectacular miracles, but with subtleties only the awakened could perceive. Ordinary people began reporting unusual experiences, vivid dreams with unknown symbols, sensations of presence in the middle of the night, intuitions that confirmed themselves with unsettling accuracy, children speaking of things they had never learned, elderly people recalling memories that did not belong to this life. It was as if a new layer of reality was being revealed. Baba Vanga is said to have said, "The veils will fall, and those with clear eyes will see what has always been there." And those eyes began to open. The collective awakening did not come through religious leaders or gurus. It came through pain. The pain of disillusionment, the pain of loss, the pain of everything that seemed secure breaking apart. And in that pain, many began to seek something beyond. They began questioning not only the system, but existence itself. They asked, who are we? Why are we here? What is really happening? Baba Vanga is said to have said, "The human spirit will be shaken, and those who do not stand firm in truth will be carried away by the wind." And that wind was already blowing. Signs from the heavens began to intensify. Lights in the sky with no explanation. Planetary alignments coinciding with political events. Changes in the Earth's magnetic field. Animals behaving differently. Plants blooming out of season. Everything seemed in sync with something greater. Baba Vanga is said to have said, "The earth will respond to the call of the sky, and those who listen will be transformed." And this transformation was not visible. It was vibrational. Those in tune felt it. Those not resisted. Trump, still surrounded by controversy, began speaking of spirituality. In an unexpected speech, he said, "The world needs to reconnect with what is real." And this statement, coming from someone long associated with material power, caused impact. Those who followed him began seeking more than politics. They sought meaning. And those who had previously criticized him began to realize that something greater was at play. Baba Vanga is said to have said, "The man who divides will be the one who points the way, even without knowing it." And that path was being revealed. Spiritual groups began forming spontaneously, not by doctrine, but by resonance. People gathered to meditate, pray, and share experiences. Communities emerged that lived according to truth, simplicity, and connection. Baba Vanga is said to have said, "Those who unite through the soul will be the ones to sustain the new world." And these sustainers were already at work, silent, discreet, yet powerful. Science began to bend before the inexplicable. Researchers admitted that phenomena existed that could not be measured, yet were real. Studies of consciousness, energy fields, and nonverbal communication began to gain traction. Baba Vanga is said to have said, "Knowledge will be remade, and those who study will have to unlearn." And this unlearning began not as denial, but as expansion. The human mind was being pushed beyond the limits it had created for itself. The event that would change everything had not yet occurred, but the signs were clear. Baba Vanga is said to have said, "The sky will open, and those who are ready will be called." And this call would not be made with words, but with vibration, a frequency that would pass through everything, touch every human being, and reveal what was hidden. Those aligned with truth would feel peace. Those bound to lies would feel pain. Because, as she said, light does not judge, it only reveals. Perhaps, looking at all of this, we can understand that the prophecy is not about an end. It is about a beginning. Baba Vanga did not speak of destruction. She spoke of revelation. And that revelation has already begun. In dreams, in signs, in encounters, in silence, in simple gestures, in eyes that meet and recognize. Because, as she is said to have declared, the new world will not be built, it will be remembered. And that memory is returning, like an echo, like a call, like a truth that can no longer be ignored. The final impact and the world after truth. What began as a sequence of revelations, rumors, and prophecies had reached its point of convergence. The world, already transformed internally, was now beginning to reorganize externally. Baba Vanga, in one of her last prophecies, is said to have stated, "When truth is accepted, the world will be redrawn with light." And this light, long ignored, was now becoming the center. It was not a physical light, nor a poetic metaphor. It was a frequency, a vibration that passed through everything: governments, religions, cultures, consciousness. And those who were ready began to feel it. The Great Awakening was not a single event, but a process culminating in a moment of impact, a day when everything stopped. Networks went offline, markets froze, systems failed, and in the midst of the silence, a broadcast was made, not by a government nor by a corporation, but by a decentralized network of people who had prepared quietly. The message was simple: the truth is among us. Now it is choice. And this choice was not about politics, nor ideology. It was about consciousness. Trump, who had been the catalyst for everything, appeared in a video recorded days earlier. In it, he said, "The world must be returned to hands of those who live in truth." There was no tone of victory, no provocation. There was serenity, as if he knew his role was over. Baba Vanga is said to have stated, "The man who begins will not be the one who finishes." And this ending was not defeat, it was passage. For now, the world belonged to those who had awakened. The structures that resisted change began to collapse. Banks closed. Corporations were abandoned. Political parties dissolved. Churches emptied. And in place of the old, the new began to emerge. Autonomous communities, spiritual support networks, exchange systems based on trust, education through experience, health based on energy. It was as if humanity were returning to the essentials, but with expanded consciousness. Baba Vanga is said to have said, "The new will be like the old, but with eyes that see." And those eyes were open. Spirituality became central, not as religion, but as practice. People began to live with presence, intention, and truth. They started connecting with nature, with silence, with the invisible. Baba Vanga is said to have said, "Those who listen to the wind will guide others." And these guides were not leaders. They were examples. People who lived simply, yet deeply, who did not need to convince, because they already were. The final impact of the revelation was not destruction, it was liberation. Humanity freed itself from narratives, fears, and dependencies. It began to live with autonomy, clarity, and purpose. Baba Vanga is said to have stated, "The world will be new when humans are new." And these men and women were already among us, not as saviors, but as seeds. Seeds of a time that no longer needs to be foretold, because it has already begun. The planet also responded. Nature began to regenerate. Animals returned to places they had disappeared from. Rivers ran clean again. The climate began to stabilize. It was as if the earth were breathing again. Baba Vanga is said to have said, "The earth is soul, and when the human soul heals, it too heals." And this healing was underway, not through technology, but through reconnection. What comes after the Great Awakening will not be utopia. It will be reality, a reality built on conscious choices, truthful relationships, living systems, a reality where power is no longer vertical, but circular, where knowledge is no longer accumulated, but shared, where time is no longer rushed, but experienced. Baba Vanga is said to have said, "Time will be felt, not counted." And this feeling had already begun. Perhaps, looking at all of this, we can understand that the prophecy was not a warning. It was an invitation to remember who we are, to live in truth, to choose the light. Baba Vanga did not intend to frighten. She wanted to prepare. And Trump, with all his paradoxes, was only the trigger, because the true protagonist is humanity. And now it is ready to live what has always been written, ready to be what always was, ready to remember that the future is not what comes, it is what is chosen.